Good evening, everyone. I would, of course, like to thank the Archaeological Society for having me here. Surprisingly, as our Honorary Secretary pointed out, I don't think I have ever spoken about Luigi Ugolini for the Archaeological Society, and she passed the comment as to what a pity that you could not hear me talk about Ugolini. I believe in Gozo, and here we are. And although Luigi Ugolini has been, again, as our Honorary Secretary reminded me all too often, an albatross round my neck for many, many, many years, and that life would be better, I think, she said, at one point, once you get rid of him, I decided that this evening I will take a different slant towards the Ugolini story, even because I get bored talking about Ugolini in the same way. So this is going to be an encounter. It's not going to be a séance. We're not going to call the dead and ask them to be present, but it is an encounter, and it's going to work on different levels. An encounter with those who have written about him and his work, an encounter with those who have written about my work, and by the word my I mean mine and that of my colleague on this venture, Andrea Vessina, who is an Italian archaeologist, and a number of collaborators too, and the encounter that I had with Ugolini and the archive, a story that starts off in 1999. And I do this because archaeologists over the years, no surprise really, but we became conscious recently that it is very, very, very hard to accept a narrative about the past as having escaped any form of bias, that the past is all objective. But in fact, a narrative about the past can be colored by the context in which it is produced. So the production of knowledge is contingent about space and place. These are my concerns. For those of you who have followed this adventure, you know that the publication project started way back, more than 20 years ago now, with the discovery of an archive in Rome, which contained a lot of the unpublished papers of this young Italian archaeologist. Young because Ugolini died aged 41 in 1936. And he could not accomplish what Andrea and I, together with Joe Mitzi of Mitzi Books, took upon ourselves to do. Foolishly, I would say. But this became una sfida. We really wanted to see everything through to publication. And I can tell you that we were about to throw in the towel many, many, many times, but the advantage of working with others means that when you are down, somebody is going to pull you up and say, no, we don't give up, we proceed. Because this is such an adventure. It is so much fun that we're working on it that we really ought to see it right through to publication. Of course, we tried only for COVID then to break, and then the publication was delayed, etc., etc. What you see on screen are the volumes that were in fact published. This is a reprint of the only book that Luigi Ugolini managed to publish in 1934, and the final volume is our attempt to provide a context for the work, which took its time to come together, as I shall point out. Today, I'm going to split the presentation into three. The first is about the reception of the work. The second, I simply ask the question whether Ugolini was right about Maltese prehistory, very briefly. And then the last bit is my own encounter with Luigi Ugolini. It is a sort of confessional. It is about being reflexive about what I have done. And I think that I do it every time I talk about Ugolini, especially to my students when they are following a course at the university on archaeological theory. The receptions have been varied. Those by Ruben Grima, when he gave advanced praise for the book, are obviously good. And of course, you might say that he is biased, and I will not go into that. We even had reviews by two individuals in particular, Giovanni Bonello and by Marcello Barbanera. I don't think that Giovanni Bonello needs any introduction to the audience gathered here. I write from a part of his piece which appeared in the Sunday Times called Resurrecting Ugolini, a Prophet Reviled. And that is, one should see these volumes as a fitting and overdue monument to Ugolini. But bottom line, they are also a monument to the two authors, Pessina and Vella, to their vision, their inexorable erudition, the pit bull perseverance. Other academics too gave copiously of their learning: Joseph Riffa, Anton Bugeja, Mario Capozzo, Henry Frindo, and Oliver Giles. I do not hesitate to classify this launch as the most pregnant Maltese editorial achievement of the decade. Those of you who know Bonello might argue that his appraisal of the work, and in particular of Ugolini's contribution to Maltese prehistory, is colored by the fact that his father, Vincenzo, and a book has just appeared about Vincenzo Bonello, which I'm really looking forward to look at, that his father, Vincenzo, was a pro-Italian nationalist, if you wish. He supported Ugolini's work in Malta, and of course we all know what happened in 1942, where with several other Maltese individuals he was interned in a camp in Uganda. And from that he did come back, etc., etc. So you might say this is biased and it is not worth anything. And then there is the review of Marcello Barbanera. Marcello Barbanera is an associate, or was actually, because we've lost him, an associate professor at the University La Sapienza in Rome, who has written copiously about the history of archaeology in Italy. And has written also amazing biographies about key figures in ancient art history, like Ranuccio, Bianchi Bandinelli, and many others. I read in Italian. You know, I count myself extremely lucky to have been born when I was, because we were brought up in the 1980s knowing Italian better than English, I think. And of course I was lucky because I was forced to learn Italian at school too. And then the rest is history. Gli autori inseriscono con equilibrio, ma senza reticenze ideologiche, la figura di Ugolini nella cultura dell'epoca. We placed Ugolini in the context of his times, fatta di colonialismo, italianità, origini della civiltà mediterranea, e inserendo le sue posizioni nel dibattito dell'Accademia italiana. Il loro obiettivo era dar conto della visione complessa e articolata in cui si è mosso il protagonista del loro lavoro, tra le sue idee personali e le ambizioni del regime. It means the fascist regime. Un contesto intricato in cui gli autori sono riusciti pazientemente a sciogliere i vari nodi con onestà intellettuale, esempio di come andrebbe fatta la storia dell'archeologia, senza revisionismi che assegnano ruoli di fascista entusiasta o per convenienza, ma come storia culturale, che ha consentito di comprendere l'attività di Ugolini quale parte integrante dell'archeologia italiana, comprendendo tutte le istanze che hanno contribuito a definirla come disciplina dalle molte sfaccettature. Essentially what we wrote is a cultural history. We have placed an archaeologist in the context of his times. Positive. And of course, this is coming from an academic, and I give it a particular weight, I think. Then, you know, the work of Ugolini cannot escape attention, especially when the word Mussolini or fascist appears on the posters. This is some text from a social media post which Oliver, and I will introduce Oliver shortly, a colleague of mine, put up when there was a note advertising a lecture that I gave at Il-Hajar at the end of September. Luigi Ugolini in Gozo, it had to be Gozo of course because it was at Il-Hajar, Mussolini's archaeologist and the island's prehistoric remains. And somebody in Oliver's social circle said, just wondering, is this meant to be a celebration of Mussolini's archaeologist? Putting the phrase Mussolini's archaeologist on a poster makes me very uneasy. After all, we wouldn't celebrate the various archaeologists of Mussolini's fellow fascists. And both regimes intensively supported archaeology for obvious ideological and expansionist reasons. Oli took the time to explain what presumably I was going to do because he never asked me, but he knows me very well. Ugolini worked on Malta as well as in Butrint in Albania, the other place where Ugolini had active archaeological fieldwork going on in the late 1920s. No, it's a talk about him, his work and the whole geopolitical context in which Italy tried to use archaeology for its own ends. He was appointed at Mussolini's behest, so in a way he was indeed Mussolini's archaeologist, not a celebration. Nick Vella and colleagues have done a fine job of publishing his important scientific results and its implications after the event. Much what we did at Butrint, much the same as we did at Butrint. Far from a whitewash, lots of research has been done about the Nazi misuse of the past too. Ugolini is an example of a decent enough man of his era who was lured by his patriotism into becoming an agent of Italian foreign policy. Many other researchers in other fields have done the same. A warning and reminder, if you will, of the sort of distortion which continues to be applied for reasons of nationalism and policy. I didn't have to reply or react in any way, shape or form because I thought Oliver did a fine job. Then comes a review, a proper review this time, in the sense that it's a review that is commissioned by a journal, an academic journal, this time the European Journal of Archaeology, having received a copy of the 4 volumes, which were kindly sent by Joe Mizzi, and the review was carried out by Robin Skeet, a professor of prehistory, Italian prehistory mostly, at the University of Durham, where he concludes, we should not completely disavow Ugolini and write off his rich corpus of work because he was a fascist. And we should be grateful to PNV for superbly bringing them back to our attention. But we should also not uncritically accept the rehabilitation of Ugolini as a young war hero turned ambitious Mediterranean archaeologist. And a quote from our work, Italian Lawrence of Arabia in Malta. Without wishing to deny the increasingly authoritarian British colonial government of Malta during the early 20th century, we should not forget that Ugolini subscribed to, benefited from, and was ultimately complicit in a totalitarian, dictatorial, belligerent, racist, male chauvinist regime. At a time now when the Italian government has recently undergone a seismic shift with the appointment of another far-right, populist and nationalist prime minister, the 4 volumes reviewed here should remind us that archaeologists and historians still face serious, consequential choices in reconstructing and revising, forgiving and forgetting. I had to read it several times, not just this bit, but others, in order to get to grips with the content, because the subtext was questioning the good faith with which we embarked on this project. And I certainly, and I think I speak for all of those who are involved in this, were driven by curiosity and scientific research, not by idolatry in any way, shape or form. Certainly we're not writing, a hagiography when we embark on this project. Because where does this leave us? There we are in 2021, I believe. We were together. It's lovely because when you work on something for 20 years, you go through the photographs and you realize that we were changing. Protuberances, in this part, grey hair, the hairlines retreat, recede, and so on and so forth. And I suspect that we were always hoping that this would never see the light of day, because that meant that our encounters would keep on happening twice, 3 times, even 4 times a year. I can tell you that when I traveled to Italy to stay with Andrea, I would never get to see anywhere. I had my leg chained to the table with a big ball, and he would say, we have to work. And conversely, that is what happened when he came over here. It's tough, because Andrea lived for several years in a house in the Boboli Gardens, behind Palazzo Pitti in Florence, and not going anywhere while you were in Firenze is really, really, really tough. Not even from the station, walking through Piazza della Signoria. No, that was too busy. We couldn't waste time. We had to take a back street. What I am trying to say is the type of criticism that we receive, and of course, may that come because it forces you to rethink. And in my case, well, it's almost making me rethink 23 years of my life, which is no joke. Because how many 23 years do we actually live? I don't regret anything, to be honest, despite the fact that the project was long, and because it was long, we had time to think really carefully through the work. When we started off in 1999, perhaps I was immature enough not to allow any obstacle to come in the way and say, no, I will stop. I remember the advice in the beginning was, no, let this project go. When I published together with Oliver the first paper, The Lure of the Antique, Nationalism, Politics and Archaeology in British Malta, the advice was stop in 1964. It's a convenient breaking point. It's independence. And somebody, a dear friend of mine said, it's only when you have your pension fund in a good Swiss bank account, because at the time you could still talk about this without being ridiculed, then you can tackle the period that follows 1964, because, by the way, it is as exciting as the previous years are. In 1999, we started off with the work, then the discovery of the archive was made a bit later. In 2005, an agreement was signed with Heritage Malta to lend the weight of an institution behind the project, and we held an exhibition at the old university where the head office was. In 2012, there was another exhibition. This time it was hosted by the then Prime Minister, Lawrence Gonzi, in his office at Castile. And I remember very, very clearly in the launch, because I was always hesitant how the Nationalist Party would take a study relating to its formative years, if you wish. And Lawrence Gonzi said, if we do not write the history of our party, who will? It has to be written, warts and all. And I think it is moments like that they tell you, okay, I can proceed. Even about the publication of that article, I had concerns because the editor of the papers of the British School at Rome was the son of a former director of the British School who features heavily in my story, as I will be able to tell you. Luckily, the son told me, I wasn't particularly fond of my dad, you can publish whatever you want. This story is all about encounters. It's all about the network within which we work. This is what is, I think, interesting about the doing, the making of something. It's actually a form of writing which we have tried to erase in the name of Cartesian science, in the name of the so-called objectivity in writing about the past. We have tried to make that narrative as bland as possible. Those of you, and there are many of you over here who are practitioners, know that interpretation happens at the trowel's edge, to quote a famous line from Ian Hodder, and that our interpretation is colored by 1,000,001 different things. Of course we follow a particular method. Of course we use a particular technique. We have been taught how to do that and we practice it. But in actual fact there are many things at play, sometimes beyond our control, that force us to follow a particular route even though we might not want that. The second point, was Ugolini right about Maltese prehistory? I'm sure you are all interested in this question. Well, let me be very clear. Yes, there was a clear need for a survey of Malta's prehistoric antiquities in the 1920s. The heyday of archaeological fieldwork was that ventennio, those 20 years. A lot of work was done, following on from the splendid work done by the antiquarians, especially A. Caruana, but then this figure of Temizamit comes into particular focus. Quintessentially, he was a servant of the crown. I think his success also depends on his character. If you want to read about him, there's a splendid biography, 2-volume by Roger Ellul Mikallef, which you can either decide to read from cover to cover, but it can lead to indigestion, or else you can simply dive into any aspect of the work and you are struck, because the book is full of detail as to how rich a story comes out from the life and times of this quite singular giant, I would say, in Malta's history. There was a need of a survey. It was very, very clear. Even Zamit himself realized this. Somebody who needs to take stock. I think my colleagues from the Superintendence of Cultural Heritage who handle new discoveries on a daily basis will probably say, oh yes, we probably need one now. But we all know what a lot of work would go into producing that, if ever we can. Certainly we'd have to break it down by period or by theme or something. Yes, there was need of a synthesis based on a thorough, written, drawn, and photographic record. Yes, the antiquity of the prehistoric remains of Malta went back to the Neolithic. This had already been said by others. Temizamit had said it. But of course, it's one thing saying it, it's another thing making an argument which is built on what you see abroad, because Malta has to be seen in context. And yes, I think that the interpretation given to Malta's megalithic remains is sound for its times. And let's face it, I would say it is also sound for our times. Because on the basis of what we know, there is only so much that we can actually say about them, even because we often lack a comparative exercise of seeing these enormous megalithic structures, which are unique, blah, 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 together with where people actually lived. We have a tiny insight from the excavations of David Trump at Scorba, information that has been forthcoming from Tachaula as a result of the practice work, etc., etc. But, do we have, when we dress up, reenactments in the prehistoric temples? Hardly. It is so hard to do something like that. I'm pretty sure that it would be easier if we had to do it in the context of a village, a cluster of huts, etc. So I could supply more information over here, but it is beyond the scope of this presentation to do so. And yet, despite all this, the latest contribution, of which, by the way, I am co-author, which looks at research pioneers of prehistoric Malta, that was published in a volume as part of the Praxis project. Well, here has them all, but there wasn't space to fit in Luigi Maria Ugolini. The vignette on the right reminds us that we stand on the shoulders of giants when we write. Of course, you can recognize most of them, but Ugolini is in fact missing. That is in 2022. Okay, this is not something that relates to 50 years ago, despite the fact that Ugolini is mentioned in the text, but a picture of him, you know, like cigarette cards there, no, that is not the place. What was accomplished in this survey? Well, those of you who know Ugolini's work will realize that he was an excellent photographer. He was, and this is one beautiful image. Those of you who know the site will realize that Ugolini caught the right time of day, and he was really finicky about this, so that there would be enough relief in order to point out, for instance, this unworked part, the ledge, the fact that the uprights fitted perfectly on raised ledges. It is though this is an IKEA set, no? Where you know where the uprights go because there is sufficient rise here to allow you to do that. You can look at the tool marks, and of course in those 5 holes on the orthostat on the right hand side, Temizami during the excavations had noticed that there were 5 shells inserted there, and that therefore those holes had to be captured properly in the photograph. And you know, if you've been to these sites and you want to photograph something, you realize that, you know, depending on the time of day, you're either going to get it or you don't. Of course, Ugolini would have even made a note that the photograph had to be retaken ore 15 at 1500 the steeple. It's a cabinet in one of the spaces, ore 15 e 30, whatever it says over here, ore 16 figure 2. So this was taken at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. By the way, the person in the photograph, the little boy, was Renato La Ferla, the architect, whose father was a close collaborator of Luigi Ugolini. I did not know until I went to speak to Renato La Ferla at his house in Slima. He was a little bit, you know, at loggerheads with Heritage Malta for something, and he said, look, I have a book still in its original box. I have a letter from Ugolini. I will allow you to copy it, but not to photograph it. And you see the picture, that is me, he said. Because otherwise we would never know this sort of information. And moments like this happened throughout this journey, of people pointing out tiny details, of meeting, and this is why my talk is about encounters. And of course, to me it was bringing me closer to the life and times of these individuals. Perhaps somewhere in me there is a love for biographical writing, for getting to know a person. I will tell you how I lost my innocence, in actual fact, and it kept me going. The survey work which was done, for which we only have a plan of the Tarsian temples, we don't have the others. We were told that the cantina in Luigi Ugolini's house at Bertinoro in Emilia-Romagna existed until the late 80s, early 90s, and then everything was thrown away. And people speak of uniforms and the equipment that was used on an excavation, etc. So possibly material survived over there. You can see the level of detail in the type of work that was produced. And of course, this was not made by Ugolini. Ugolini had an architect, had a draftsman to work for him, but he would direct them as to the level of detail and information that was required in order to make this document of use to archaeologists who would not be able to visit the site and experiencing it firsthand. He even came up with a development of temple architecture over time, based, of course, on the material available to him. This is the tough thing about assessing the work of somebody who died in 1936. It is useless for me to bring to bear on a study that looks at the 1920s and 1930s all the knowledge that happened afterwards. It would be an obviously stupid thing to do. It's useless to say, you know, radiocarbon dating did this and that, because in actual fact, Ugolini did not know of radiocarbon dating. And if I press the next slide, here I show you on the bottom right-hand side the development of temple architecture, which David Trump published in the 1980s. And you will see that elements of this development is already present in Ugolini's work. Of course, Scorba does not feature because Scorba was excavated in the 1960s. But you will get my point that what he was trying to do was actually right, and I think it was what was expected by somebody who actually gave heart and soul to this project. When I say heart and soul, because you will realize how difficult it was, for instance, for Temi Zammit to be rector of the university, professor of chemistry, directing the museum. I mean, it's really tough, which is not surprising that we learned that Temi Zammit had to rely, for example, on the help of many individuals and institutions in order to deliver what he did. Although I think he was astute enough to keep a view of what was being done. Look at the objects, the way that they were photographed. You can check any publication which appeared before 1934, and this level of detail, which appears only when it was published in this book from 1934, had never been seen before. This is the first time that we get something of this high quality. The image on the top serves to remind me that one photograph under specific conditions of light and shade would not be enough. You would go back at a different time in order to get the right conditions to photograph the detail needed. He gave attention to potsherds. It is already something that appeared earlier. Certainly Manuel Magri was interested in potsherds before we hear of cartloads of potsherds in the 19th century being taken to the museum or indeed thrown away. Well, in this case, Ugolini realized that the potsherds had not been properly documented, and the ones from what we call the temple period are beautifully decorated, incredibly decorated, and these were described and photographed, and also in some cases the pottery was drawn according to the conventions of the time. Again, we don't see this happening in other publications, so they are a first. And you can see the typescript. We have both manuscript, we have typescript, often first draft, second draft, and the sketches really helped us in identifying what goes with what, because in trying to put everything together, it was no easy task. How do you date things before the invention of radiocarbon dating? Well, you try a comparative exercise, like with like. And we know that at the time, the spiral motif had already intrigued archaeologists. After the discoveries made at Hajar Im by Vance in the 1830s, and the subsequent investigations by Schliemann at Mycenae, the spiral became a motif that linked different areas of the Mediterranean. And this was so for a very, very long time, so much so that it was thought by the likes of Arthur Evans, photographed here at Knossos, together with a large pot where the spiral design occurs, that there must be a link between what is happening in the Aegean and what is happening in the central Mediterranean. And the arrows of diffusion, of course, always went from east to west. Ex Oriente lux, light from the east. Temi Zammit was not convinced by this. He even gave an estimate for the age of the prehistoric temples, coming up with 3000 BC, which we know is right. I remember reading an article in the press in the United States when somebody was repeating what Zammit found, and they decided to drop a zero off because this was, fantastic. 3000? No, it can't be. It must be 300 BC. Ugolini entered the fray and changed all this. A culture before the Cretan one, that of Crete. This was the big thing. So much so that in December 1924, in his first visit to the Maltese Islands, he spent here 3 weeks. He was sent here by Roberto Faribeni, a member of the fascist party, high up, responsible for all archaeological missions abroad. And he says here very clearly, he is relating to the spirals. Le spirali sono veramente neolitiche ed allora sono una rivelazione, oppure, se si vuole stabilire un sincronismo concreta, sono del medio minoico 2 e allora dovrebbero essere dell'età del bronzo. È piuttosto avanzato, ma la seconda contrasta al materiale neolitico. It doesn't quite fit. The spirals might look alike, but the rest doesn't. È un po' troppo difficile pensare che i maltesi accogliessero solo la spirale e una tecnica e uno stile così perfetti e non il metallo, il bronzo, cioè i tipi di strumenti propri a questa età. Ora, in base a queste induzioni, se si avvicina tra loro il gruppo di materiale maltese e quello cretese egeo, if you compare the material, which he did because he visited the museums and saw the material firsthand, si arriva ad una deduzione che, a dire il vero, tremo nell'annunciarla. I'm terrified actually making this announcement. Malta anteriore a Creta, Malta before Crete. La cosa è grave per le ripercussioni che può avere in tutte le questioni sull'origine e diffusione di prodotto industriale, di arte e di civiltà. The repercussions of such a statement here are grave, he said. This was in December, after only 3 weeks working at the museum, which was still in Palazzo Sciarra, opposite St. John's Co-Cathedral at the time, where the material must have been put on display by Zammit properly in showcases, etc., etc., and he realized that something was not quite right already at the time. He takes another 6 years to come back in 1930. Between 24 and 30, he was busy in Albania. He tried to come over once, he didn't manage, and we had to wait quite a few years to have him back. Of course, the work that he was presenting, his interpretation, was based on the amazing work that Kenny Zammit did at Tarshin, where at Tarshin, Zammit noticed that there was a clear stratification and that the study of the stratification, the stratigraphy, revealed a clear distinction between the Stone Age levels, the Neolithic levels, and those which contained objects of metal, the Bronze Age. Clear distinction, separate. And Paolo Orsi, the famous prehistorian, declared this to be un fatto meraviglioso. Finally, because we knew that most of these prehistoric sites had been not excavated properly, but very often just cleared, without proper excavation. Tarshin, we were lucky, because this was a site below a field. Nobody had got to it before, possibly the Romans, I think. The rest of the sites had been really monuments. They never became an archaeological site, they were visible. Certainly Hajar'in, certainly Imnaidra, certainly Gigantia. You cleared them from the collapses, but they were there standing, not reduced to ruin, which is very, very interesting why that, in fact, happened. Tarshin was a completely different story. And of course, Ugolini had access not only to the person who dug there, who of course was getting old by that time, but could ask him questions. You know, he would turn up with a list of questions specific to certain excavations, and he would say yes, no, and he would mark them out as an aide-memoire so that he could write the text. But Zammit also allowed him to see his notebooks, and he also, and this is something that was confirmed only recently, he was also shown the photographs. that were taken at the time. We were not sure whether Ugolini had seen the photographs, but we are certain about that. The photography is splendid. As you can see, the picture over here shows the original reliefs still in situ. Before they were covered over, not removed, covered over with slabs of modern limestone. The replicas covered the originals. In time, the originals were actually moved to the museum, leaving the slabs which covered them in place. The exercise, as I said, to try and figure out what was based on comparanda, with Troy, with Crete, with the Aegean, with Sardinia, with North Africa, the Balearics and Sicily. I thought I would have the time to come up with a map showing you the museums that he visited and the travels he undertook. This would have even been good for the book, but I didn't have time to do it, something that I ought to do, to see, how things moved in space, or how he moved in space, and how ideas changed. Needless to say, every visit to a museum would be accompanied by avid note-taking and sketching. All this information. This reminds me of Malta. The horns seen at the museum in Cairo remind me of the stuff from Tarshian, etc., etc., etc. Amazing work. And of course, the interpretation. The way, if you look at the only book which was published at the time, and Malta, Origine della Civiltà Mediterranea, is actually the interpretation. It's lucky that we have the interpretation. God forbid if we had the survey, but not the concluding remarks which are here, show us how he reasoned things out, how he reached a conclusion based on the data. So the interpretive exercise is laid out for us. And we cannot say much in this sense for other archaeologists who are blind to the idea that what was in Malta was in fact quite original, and you do not have to seek the origins elsewhere, because you're not comparing like with like, because they are out of sync. The Aegean is later than the phenomenon that Ugolini was studying here. How did we put everything together? Well, relatively easy, because we were lucky that Luigi Ugolini had published one volume in a series called Albania Antica, and this is, you see the picture here, of the second volume called L'Acropoli di Fenice. These were excavations that were carried out by him, and one of the volumes was published, and we said, let us follow this in the way that we present the material. Why? Because this was, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of papers, which we tried to make sense of and put them in order. So that is what we did, starting with a description of the monument, then looking at all the objects, material culture, etc., etc. We also took it upon ourselves, and here, when we were despairing, at one point, the good Anton Bugeja at the back there came in to help us, not for Tarshian, I think, because there were risks to be taken if he embarked on Tarshian at that point, because he had done enough with the other volumes, to supply information that brings, not up to date, but providing a commentary to what authors have been saying since the 1930s about a particular site. We also embarked on an exercise with Sharon from the Museum of Archaeology to provide object identification numbers for the finds, so that if you want to study a particular object, you'd know what is the object ID for the Museum of Archaeology. Fun, madness, something I think in between. But once you start, then we had to take it forward. How was the volume received, in particular Malta, Origine della Civiltà Mediterranea? Even here, the reception varies. In Italy, Ugolini was not given a particularly good welcome. Ugolini's work was not reviewed positively, because I suspect that he was supposed to have been sent to Malta to try and find cultural links with Italy. And I think originally the idea was to study the Roman remains, but the Roman remains were not impressive enough. It was the prehistory that was impressive. And instead he writes something that he says, no, hang on, the origins of everything are here, not in Italy, in Malta. And in a copy that was in the possession, a copy of the book that was in the possession of Timmy Zammit's family, there is two typewritten letters, one from Ugolini to Zammit, and then the reply from Zammit to Ugolini. It's always lovely to say and to recall how you would get access to see these collections. These are not easy. A good word. My mother was involved, I remember, and another old lady was involved, and we vouch for him, and he's okay, and etc., etc. Amazing. Caro dottor Ugolini, grazie del magnifico volume, mandatomi in omaggio e giuntomi qualche giorno addietro. Non so perché ella teme che io mi possa risentire, trovando che in certi punti le nostre vedute, mie e sue, nostre, non possono conciliarsi. Because Ugolini said, look, we might disagree on some issues. And he says, not really. Come vecchio studente di scienza positive, so bene che nuovi studi portino nuove vedute perché o progredire o perire. È dunque naturale che la sua opera richiedeva mano libera per rivedere materiale così vario venuto alla luce da molto tempo e spesso da mani inesperte. Dare un giudizio d'assieme dell'opera sua è facile ed io glielo porgo sin d'ora. Opera eccellente, lavorata con intendimenti moderni e con arte somma da ogni punto di vista. Prosit. That is, and placed within quotes, almost saying, if you want to use that, you may. And then it goes on and on, thanking him for mentioning Zammit in his works. Again, remember that the literature, many of the letters that we have used were meant to be between person A and person B. They were probably never meant to be discussed in public as I am doing in the year of our Lord 2023. In fact, if you see Zammit's letter to the editor of the Manchester Guardian, I believe, which says that Luigi Ugolini, an origin article said that Luigi Ugolini had been carrying out excavations in Malta, had discovered amazing things, da-di-da. Zammit writes back and he says, no, hang on. Ugolini never excavated in Malta. He only made sense of the work that I accomplished. And of course he carried out a survey, but he did not dig at all. Now, of course, Zammit might have wanted to distance himself. The years were hot years, okay? Wanted to distance himself from this Italian archaeologist who had been sent to Malta and had the support of the fascist regime, although this is never mentioned. How was the work taken on by mainstream? And I have to say that mainstream really means British, whether you like it or not, archaeology. Well, and you have books here which you would expect to find a reference to Ugolini's work in Christopher Hawkes, Gordon Child, Stuart Piggott and Glyn Daniel, and they were lukewarm at best. They all said that the photography is amazing. Gordon Child said that the material is original. Much of the prehistoric material is original, and because it's original, it's worth considering, but really nothing to write home about. And of course, we're looking at a finished book. It is the assessment of the work of an archaeologist, but we do not know whether Hawkes was involved in any work that impinged directly or indirectly on Ugolini's work or later work. In actual fact, we do know that he was, and so many others. What kicked off a reaction to Ugolini's work was in fact a letter that was written to the Times in London, and then it was reproduced in Malta, a letter that was written by Eugene Strong. Eugene Strong had been an assistant director and librarian at the British School at Rome. And we know that the British School in Rome had been involved in the archaeological explorations done in Malta because Semi Zammit was a very, very good friend of the director Thomas Ashby. Thomas Ashby and Eugene Strong fell out. The falling out was so immense that the British decided that they would not renew the contract either of the director or the librarian. Ashby goes back home, falls off a train, and that's it. Whereas Eugenie Strong remained in Rome as she was a fine Roman art expert. And in fact, when Mussolini inaugurated the Ara Pacis in Rome, she was the person who made a speech. And of course, this was a way of getting back at the British, because I'm pretty sure that the Italians had many classical archaeologists who could have delivered that speech. Instead, they chose Strong. And in that letter, Strong said, you know, we should really take stock of what Ugolini had tried to do and build on it. That letter received a scathing reply from an Oxford Don, John Myers, professor of ancient history, who had been following for more than 20 years all archaeological work being done in Malta by different individuals. And, you know, the reply was really terrible. And also a reply by Gordon Child. And he explains why, you know, there are issues with Ugolini's work. I will not go into the details, but I can tell you that this correspondence created a lot of concern in the colonial office. And it led to the setting up of the first chair of archaeology, which was held by John Ward Perkins, funded by the British Council. It's the British Council that paid for the professorship, and the professorship was there in order to start a survey of Malta's prehistoric antiquities. So let's forget everything that Ugolini did. There's no hope in hell that we're going to, especially in 1939, that we're going to talk to our Italian friends. Let's start afresh. And in fact, this plan continued in the 1950s, was only picked up in the 1950s when John Evans was chosen as the person to conduct the survey, and this led to the publication in 1971 of the book The Prehistoric Antiquities of the Maltese Islands. It took ages to be produced, so much so that when John Ward Perkins was trying to rally the favor of Sir Mortimer Wheeler, shown in the picture between David Trump and Charlie Zammit, this is what he said. It is perhaps not out of place to know that in 1963, an Italian expedition launched an attack on one of the few remaining excavable sites in Malta, accompanied by a barrage of publicity highly nationalistic in tone. This was the excavation at Tassilj. Okay? Those who have seen the excavation will appreciate that the word attack is used advisedly. But this will not prevent the publication of a lot of tendentious and half-baked nonsense comparable to that classic of pre-war fascist archaeological ineptitude, Ugolini's Malta e le origini della civiltà mediterranea. The proper answer to this sort of thing is to show how it should be done, which Evans's survey publication is well calculated to do. Splendid letter, which is in the archives of the British School at Rome. So much so, he was of this firm belief, John Evans, that in his PhD publication, a copy of which was kindly shown to me by Anton Bugeja here, you can see that his chronology is still tied to developments elsewhere, and under Sicily, where you have Castelluccio, so that's the Bronze Age, 1600. Why? Because at Castelluccio in Sicily there are spirals. The spirals date to Mycenaean times, possibly a little bit earlier, but nowhere do they come close to the guess estimate that was produced by Zammit and also welcomed by Luigi Ugolini. In fact, this book went against all ideas at the time, which is why I think Ugolini's work is really an unwritten chapter in Mediterranean prehistoriography, if you want, because this has never been accepted. And we are being told, if you go by what the reviewer wrote for our work, we should be wary about even accepting that today. Why can we have issues with what Ugolini wrote? Well, in the last few pages of the book, and if you don't believe me, you can come and have a look at it yourself, he wrote this sort of thing. A high sense of grandeur pervades all the manifestations of these people, endowed with high moral power, deep religious spirit, great force of organization, and finally marked building abilities. It is a type of language that any fascist would be using in order to describe ancient Roman civilization. High moral power, deep religious spirit, great force of organization. Our old but still healthy Mediterranean world rose to the highest apogees of civilization and of glory on remote times, not to transfusions of northern blood or for influxes of oriental civilization, but thanks to fertile and powerful energies congenital in the race. It is to brown-skinned, long-headed people that the Mediterranean and most of Europe owe the rapid, perennial cultural progress. This is in the epilogue to the book. That is the conclusion. Of course, I think he was writing in such a way that would be loved by those supporting him. In 1959, John Evans publishes his Malta, which you all know. This is essentially exactly what Ugolini did. Ugolini published the conclusions before the survey. That's exactly what Evans did. He published the conclusions in this book, dated 1959, and then because he was being pestered continuously by the likes of Brian Ward-Perkins, by John Ward-Perkins and others, he finally submitted his opum for publication. This is it. This is his claim. Only one large-scale attempt was made at a general study and evaluation of the prehistoric material during the early 30s by the Italian archaeologist Ugolini. But his study and its main conclusions, namely that in the Maltese Neolithic might be sought the origin of Mediterranean civilization, were vitiated by political bias. Nevertheless, it is interesting to know that in 1933, it was still possible for such a claim to be made without bringing immediate ridicule upon its author. Apart from its immediate aim as part of the fascist government's campaign of political infiltration in Malta, the idea was the counterpart of the Nazi prehistorians' search for the origins of culture in the backwoods of northwest Europe. Both had their origin, like some more serious archaeological thinking of the time, in a violent reaction away from the theory, whose basic principle is now almost universally accepted as axiomatic, that all the major steps in the attainment of civilization were taken in the Near East and first affected Europe largely as a result of the fusion from that region. And with that statement, Ugolini's work was forgotten completely. We know that Ugolini was supported by a number of individuals. Here you see them: Quirino Giglioli, Roberto Paribeni, Francesco Ercole, Biscottini. These were all part and parcel of the fascist regime. I do not need to go into detail about this. And in fact, they became even more vigorous involved in Maltese affairs after Ugolini's death, when the propaganda on the part of the fascists increased, because the constitution in Malta was suspended in 1933, and because of the Abyssinian crisis, there was a tit for tat between the Italians and the British. For instance, the British School of Art in Rome, directed by Antonio Shortino, was closed down when the Italian Istituto Italiano di Cultura here was closed down. It was one thing happening here, another thing had to happen in Italy in the form of retaliation. The letter which is shown over here reminds us of the interest after Ugolini's death to make sure that his uncompleted works would be completed and would be published. in fact, this did not happen. You will realize how the narrative that was produced of prehistory by Luigi Ugolini, the perfect golden age in the Temple period, in the Neolithic, everything going badly wrong because of invasions in the Bronze Age, and the wish for a national rebirth. Essentially, it is saying that there was a golden age in Malta, which is when Italy featured heavily in the life and times of the Maltese, and there was suffering under the occupation by the British, but there will be one fine day rebirth, of course, under the nationalists. That is the way I see it. Amongst the papers, there isn't much that brings out Ugolini's fervor, except that in one letter he wrote to Bonello, to Giovanni Bonello, "Sta bene, abbi sempre la tua indiscussa fede in quell'avvenire che è già segnato." This was 1931. That is the only reference that I could find in letters which are in the possession of Bonello's son, Giovanni, and which I saw. You see in the picture here, Vincenzo Bonello. On the right-hand side, Don Albert Pantaleresco, the other cleric, I have no idea who it is, and Luigi Ugolini. The timeline, and I do not need you to go through this, is really interesting, and I was forced to do it yesterday because I wanted to put into context something which I want to share with you, and this is not published anywhere. In 1932, the constitution had been restored. Ugolini was in Malta between April and July. Therefore, he was present during the general elections, which the Italians win. He was present when there was an exhibition at the Istituto di Cultura in Valletta. There were concerns expressed in London that Ugolini might be made director of the museum's department. Temizamit, remember, was in place until his death. It was only for a fortnight, even less than a fortnight, between the 1st of April and the 11th of May, that he was ill, and Bonello was made acting director, and Charlie was made acting curator. And I think there were concerns, and these concerns were expressed in London as to how to deal with it. And the conversation, or the correspondence, was cut short, and they said cynically, you know, if you want this to happen, let the Maltese take care of it. This is the correspondence that was had between people at the British Museum who had not heard of Ugolini. They said, who on earth is he? We are not even sure that he's called Ugolini and that we are writing it properly as for the name. They said the Maltese will resent getting an outsider to take this role. I do not need to go through this because we do not have the time, but a timeline to the level of month and date is essentially to put together the picture over here. Needless to say, all the activities in which the Italians were involved were being carefully monitored by agents that the British had, including Italians who had infiltrated the groups of people who used to meet at Café Premier, etc., etc. What this book does is produce a jewel, if you wish, for the nationalists. A nation, or the origins of a nation, had been created in book form. In book form, which is not your average publication that we have seen on prehistory. Before I came here, I put this side by side with Temizamit's Prehistoric Malta, produced by Oxford Clarendon Press. It has no parchment. This has a half binding in parchment, gold lettering, a beautiful royal blue. And we also know that the final proofs were approved by Mussolini himself. Ugolini was disgusted because the paper was so thin that you could actually see the photographs right through. And they said, no, reprint this again. because this was the making of the island's history, which of course the nationalists could actually use to further their message. But because the message has to be pro-Italian, a unique ingredient, language was already treated badly, but a unique ingredient in the island's history was actually put aside. So much so that a month after Ugolini dies, Enrico Mizzi travels to Rome in order to inaugurate the new premises of a propaganda bureau, the Regia Deputazione per la Storia di Malta. And you know what he says? Oh, it's good to have the prehistory narrative produced by Ugolini, but what we wish for is something that can enhance the value of its Roman past. I think Ugolini was already turning in his grave by then, and this was barely a month later. To conclude my encounter with Luigi Ugolini, let me tell you why I'm looking at this. Look at what the reviewer had to say, but it is the high quality of Ugolini's photograph that stands out both technically and aesthetically. Thanks to the painstaking research undertaken by P&V, these add significant value to the 3 volumes, especially as regards of past, historical and present ways of seeing Maltese antiquities. However, by rendering the reconstructed Malta Antica series so visually enchanting, Pessina and Vella almost blind us to Ugolini's politics and to their own. Let me tell you, if there is one good thing about publishing locally, is that the likes of Joe Mixie, who put heart and soul towards the publication, which will never tell you the maximum you can publish is 10 images, you know. And they can be the size of a stamp. They will tell you, proceed. Then we shall see. So over here, the images are taken to be a way of actually blind you readers to, well, Ugolini's politics. We have heard about them. And I leave it to historians, if they have the patience, to judge where culture history comes in. And we have many able historians, not least the workings of Henry Frendo, who have thrown light on the matter. As to my politics, well, I told you that I have always been driven by curiosity. And then you also have something here. They appear to accept that their work contributes to a rehabilitation of the figure of Luigi Ugolini, but go on to argue that Ugolini's competence cannot be negated a priori just because he adhered to the fascist party, and to question if indeed he was a fascist, although they have to conclude that he was indeed very close to the regime. This leads me to ask, perhaps too bluntly for Pessina and Vella's sensibilities, what are their own politics and identities? And the rest is not co-relevant. Again, you start wondering what on earth is going on. Well, let me tell you what I knew about Ugolini when I was a student. Hardly anything. And it was only when I was asked, as part of an assignment in Maltese prehistory, taught by Professor Bonanno, to do a little bit of research about the coverings of the temples. What are they like? And of course, you can't do that without looking at the book that was published by Carlo Ceschi in the late 30s, Architettura dei Templi Megalitici di Malta. And of course, you can't look at Ceschi if you don't look at the companion volume. That is my only knowledge of Luigi Ugolini. And I knew, however, that the frontispiece of the book showed that there were incomplete works. Malta Antica 1, 2, 3, etc. That's so much I knew. And when one fine day, I think it must have been December 1998, I was enjoying the sun on the steps of this venerable British institution, because where does a Maltese person go to further his or her studies beyond university? Well, we go to England, and then in Rome, you go to the British school. Our present Archbishop was at the Venerable English College. Yours truly was at the British school at Rome at the time. And I was there trying to recover from the horrific weeks leading up to the submission of the PhD. And there comes this individual who was really sweating, called Oliver Giles. And we got talking, and he said, I am researching Luigi Ugolini. You should do likewise. Luigi Ugolini, as I told you, I had barely heard about him, and I knew very little. And he said, we have found his unpublished works about Albania, and he said, I am sure that his unpublished works on Malta are somewhere to be found in Rome. And that was it. And to be honest, this intrigued me, even because, as luck would have it, I bumped into this statue of Fortunato Mizzi in the Pincio Gardens, and I asked myself, what on earth is he doing there? And then one night, when I was using the library of the British School, I came across this pamphlet by Guido Puccio called Malta Italianissima. It was published by a Comitato d'Azione Maltese at the height of the war to rally the support of those Maltese in Italy to help in the cause of Italianità. And the funny thing is that this booklet contained a letter from military intelligence to John Ward Perkins, who had become the director of the British School at Rome, which is why this pamphlet ended up over there when the family gave his books, saying clearly John Ward Perkins had reported this sort of literature to military intelligence in London, and he wanted action to be taken. So many things were happening, which forced me to get an interest in the history of Maltese archaeology. And when I said I would like to enter the archives of the British School at Rome, the answer quickly was, no, you can't. This is the usual story, because the archive has not yet been properly organized. Luckily, there was an archive research fellow from Australia, and he got me in through the back doors. And I managed to see the papers related to Malta's archaeology, and that is where I lost my innocence. I had never done research of this sort, and the beauty of it was not how the British were interacting with the Maltese, but how the Brits interacted together about the Maltese. And that is where I think I realized that the production of anything in a professional field has a story. Again, you might tell me this is nothing new, but I had not opened up to this idea. The only person that had looked until my time to the history of archaeology as an interesting undertaking was Daphne Caruana Galizia in her long essay as part of her undergraduate degree in archaeology, when she wrote about A.A. Caruana, because she had some papers that came through her husband's family. So that type of investigation was welcomed. If you wrote historiography at the time on OPAC at the University of Malta, only one dissertation came up later, and that is Jasper the Trepid. His mom is here. He is the only person who had written a dissertation on historiography of the time of the Knights by looking at one particular work that had been produced in England about the Knights. That was it. Then I saw a book, L'Architettura on Malta. I came back. I tried to look for the papers. I failed. And in a book, L'Architettura on Malta, there was a footnote in an article which said that the last person who had seen these papers, Ugolini's unpublished papers, was a certain Marina Riccio, and that the papers were at a particular museum in Rome. And that's how I got in touch with Andrea Pessina together with Oliver. And, really and truly, the rest is history. But there was also a far more interesting encounter. And that came through another person who is in the audience. You see how interesting this whole thing is. Rachel Radmilli, who one fine day, bil-Malti ngħidu friska bħal ħassa, she told me, yes, and I was telling her about Ugolini. She said, yes, no big deal. I know about Ugolini because my great aunt, Auntie Berta, knew him. And we have books signed by him, and we also have photographs. And bomba da ġejja. And she's still alive, she said. Come, still alive. How old is she? She was in her early 90s at the time, but she said she's all there. And I said, Auntie Berta is the highest of in the picture here in the group. They're all together at Tarshin. These are copies, by the way. They are not the originals. The originals are hidden underneath the copies. And I asked Rachel, I said, can we meet her? She asked, and she said, well, no. Auntie Berta doesn't want to talk about the 1930s. And of course, I think Rachel being an anthropologist, knows how important this thing was, certainly for me, and I think she was intrigued too. And by hook or by crook, we actually met her. That's the picture that Rachel took, top right. Auntie Bertha was accompanied by her. Who was the person next to her? There was Karen's Nana there, present. Your grandmother. Your grandmother was present, the chaperone, ġifiri, we had crisps and some soft drink, and she told us all about it. And that brought it all to life once again. And there were many things which she clarified for us, which were quite fun. Some of the pictures, including this one top left, is amazing. This is taken at the house of Sir Arturo Mercia in San Paolo Tarja, I believe, and we identify all the figures there. We found reference to this particular photograph in mail that was preserved by Vincenzo Bonello, and of course the picture grew. We know that in Mercia's autobiography, Ugolini is referred to in a fantastic way, a well-mannered gentleman. The original is in Italian, of course. Pleasant in conversation. He made us greatly appreciate his friendship, and we spent unforgettable hours in his company. May his memory be honored, and peace reward his generous soul. We know very clearly that Ugolini was quite keen on Mari, his eldest daughter, shown here in the picture. And she is here next to Auntie Berta. I think it's Auntie Berta who had a crush on Ugolini, but nothing came out of it. All correspondence had to go from Ugolini to Vincenzo Bonello, from Vincenzo Bonello to Sir Arturo Mercia, and then make it in the hands of the daughter, because that is how things were done at the time. There was none of this social media business. For Strickland, and this is one reference that we have, lo Strickland ha detto varie volte, I know it's getting on, forgive me, lo Strickland ha detto varie volte a miei conoscenti che io sono l'unico italiano col quale egli può parlare apertamente. Mi ha difeso contro attacchi dei suoi partigiani, mi ha messo a disposizione la sua stamperia per una traduzione in inglese del mio volume su Malta. A translation has been planned. Traduzione che egli desidererebbe moltissimo. Una volta mi disse anche: lei è il Lawrence d'Arabia dell'Italia a Malta, ma lei agisce così bene che noi inglesi non possiamo non stimarla. There was nothing that they could say about him, even because whenever he spoke in Malta, he did not talk about Malta. He always spoke about Albania, his work in Albania. So there was no way that his words about Malta could be misconstrued by the agents who were present, for instance, reporting that when he gave his lecture at the old university, he gave the fascist salute. And in fact, he appears here in an album that was in the personal possession of Temi Zamni, photographed at Calypso's cave, indeed giving the fascist salute, as you can see over here. I don't need to go through the details. As I said, this is the penultimate slide. Things picked up after Ugolini's death. Biscottini and Francesco Ercole worked tirelessly to provide propaganda that could be used by the pro-Italian nationalists in Malta. This caused the ire of the British. Perhaps you may argue for very obvious reasons. I was looking at some documents from the Colonial Office and the Foreign Office yesterday that had been traced by Anton and by Josef Briffa for us, and you can see the concern that existed as to the amount of propaganda that the Italians were allowed to make in Malta by using Italian money in order to sell papers, setting up a bookshop near the palace, etc., etc. There was even a fantastic exhibition made of the Italianità di Malta. If you go into the website of Istituto Luce and you write Italianità di Malta, you see the inauguration of this thing. It is incredible that when we were presenting the books in Milan earlier this year, that the son of the nephew of the individual over here, Viscontini, was present. And he told us what he recalls from the time. He even recalls that the archive of the Regia Deputazione per la Storia di Malta before the war was actually walled up in an attic in a palazzo. And we are dying to try and find out where that is. The Nucleo dei Carabinieri is ready to bring in the equipment in order to see whether that archive can actually be found. My last slide is this one. And I come clean that I do not have any fascist sympathies. I'm not right-wing in any way, shape or form. I told you I am curious about the history of my country's archaeology. And I do not think I need to apologize in any way, shape or form for what I did. If anything, I have to say that I had great fun in trying to figure out this amazing web, a social network that existed and that allowed the production of knowledge. I think this is owed not only to those who worked in the past, but also those who were caught up. And we know what happened to them in 1942 because they had Italian sympathies. I think we owe to them and to the archaeologists who came before us a narrative that can be reviewed, that can be reinterpreted. You can do whatever you like. I am sure that in 20 years' time, in 10 years' time, we might be looking at this whole issue through a different viewpoint or a different lens. But to bring into question my own integrity and good faith in undertaking this job, as seems to be the case with some individuals, that is simply not on. Thank you.